One of the biggest leaps in humanity started during the Industrial Revolution around 1760. Before this time, almost every single thing was made by hand, one at a time, without machines in the sense of how we think of them today. But due to the harnessing of the power locked in converting water into steam with those machines, this opened up possibilities to do things at a much faster speed and power like never seen before. And ingenious and ambitious people seized this new technology to create their fortunes and change the world into what we know today in terms of health, education, travel, and even footwear. And several inventions over the next few decades continue to speed up and standardize the footwear industry. With 1844, rubber was patented by chemist Charles Goodyear, which the Goodyear tires are named after. 1846, the sewing machine was invented. 1862, the first Goodyear welt machine was invented by Auguste Destoy. And all these new inventions in the footwear industry led to faster production speeds and higher quantities. But not every single invention improves the end product for the consumer, because prior to this time, footwear was made by hand, leading to a better fit and comfort. And the best shoemakers would measure a person's foot and carve that shape out of a block of wood, which would be used to shape the shoe or boot around, and they called that a last. And that term comes from an old English term, last, it means barefoot. But due to the Industrial Revolution, last started to become more universal and sizes started to be established across the board instead of completely custom fit and measurements, which meant footwear became less comfortable and less healthy for your foot, especially for women. Have you ever seen any of those women's shoes from like the late 1800s? They literally look like little doll shoes. But these problems were especially apparent when it came to the military, as the Industrial Revolution also opened up industrialized war, with one of the biggest examples being the Franco-German War of 1870, where over 3 million soldiers were deployed, and more stateside, the Spanish-American War in 1898, where one of the most important and influential people in footwear history, Dr. Edward Lyman Munson, a doctor from Yale, served abroad as a medical officer in Cuba and in the Philippines. And during his time as a health officer, he saw the clear value in healthy soldiers and especially their feet. And in 1908, the Surgeon General of the Army selected Munson to lead the newly formed Army Shoe Board. And Munson had taken a special interest in poorly fitting boots due to infections caused by ill-fitting dress shoe shaped lasts that all boots were made on at the time. So from 1908 to 1912, the shoe board tested and studied the feet of 2,000 soldiers, and they studied the effect of different shapes of these lasts and how they affected the soldiers' ability to perform their tasks. They would even go so far as to take radiographs of the soldiers' feet to see how different shapes held their foot and toes in different ways. And in 1912, Munson published a book, The Soldier's Foot and the Military Shoe. It was a revolutionary look at footwear and detailed the problems the shoe board found with military boots that needed to be changed. Like, they need to be firm but flexible enough, easy to put on and off, as durable as possible. But his biggest takeaways that changed the footwear industry was the shape of the last. Because the heel needed to be broad, flat, long, and solid, the inside of the shoe over the heel should not be too wide. The posterior wall of the shoe should be curved as to embrace the natural curvature of the heel. There needed to be plenty of room across the ball of the foot. The toe cap must be high. And most importantly, and a big part of this boot, is the shoe must also have such a shape as to permit the great toe returning towards its proper alignment. And with all this information and recommendations, Munson and the shoe board set out to make a last that A, fit as many soldiers as comfortably as possible, and B, corrected the foot deformities that current soldiers were experiencing due to that ill-fitting footwear. And that same year, Munson patented his new last, and it was so well received by the War Department that they commissioned shoes to be produced for the Army as a standard issue boot, the 1912 Russet shoe. And this last was used through some of the most pivotal and important wars in history, with World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. So why aren't every single pair of boots and shoes built on the Munson last? And more particularly, why aren't the toughest boots made for the harshest jobs using this last that was invented over 100 years ago? Well, one of these companies finally did, but it's not without its downsides, because there's plenty of good reasons why these hardest working, toughest boots in the world still use ridiculously narrow lasts. So we're gonna dissect this boot, run it through our test, and I'll show you exactly why. So what is this boot? Well, the brand is Nix. The style is the Builder Pro on the Munson-inspired Thurman NW Moderate Arch Last. They weigh just over 3 pounds. They retail for $589. They're made in Spokane, Washington, mecca for the toughest boots in the world. And the way that Nix positions this boot is, are you on your feet 8 to 12 hours a day? The Builder Pro was designed with you in mind. If you're a tradesman, mechanic, warehouse worker, construction worker, logger, or you're doing anything else where you're on your feet all day, this is your boot. Combining the highest grade leather on the market and our legendary arch support technology, you can't beat the Builder Pro for serious work. And if you want to a pair of these, be sure to check them out via links in my description. And thanks to Nix for sending us this boot and sponsoring this video that allows us to really dig into the history and tell this important story in footwear history. So what do I mean by the toughest boots in the world? Let's start looking at the materials, starting with the leather, because this leather is 3.8 millimeters thick. Compare that to most work boots from 2 to 2.5 millimeters thick. You can see why they're pretty tough. And this is just an especially thick hide. Most of the time it's around 3 to 3.5. We just got a thick hide in this boot. And to show you how tough it is, we put on the puncture test and it took 304 pounds to puncture through. And that's just with one layer of leather, because most of this boot is unlined. The only lining is right here in the vamp, and with that lining, it's almost 5 millimeters thick of leather surrounding your toes. And this is their soft toe. They come in like steel toes, they come in structured toes. So this is the thinnest toe that you can get, and it's still 5 millimeters thick. We haven't even talked about the counter, because you have another layer of that leather that wraps around the heel, which covers a really thick veg tan heel counter that kind of what Munson talked about, that cradles that heel, wraps around the heel, structuring that to make sure your heel's not slipping back and forth. That's not even the craziest part about these boots, because there's over an inch of material separating you from the ground when your foot is in the boot, because it has about a 1/4 inch of a leather insole, a similar thickness of a leather midsole. You have basically a 1/4 inch of a rubber slip sole. And since they use that really thick rubber midsole, they don't sew all the way through the outsole like you sometimes see on Nix boots. And this Vibram V100 outsole is 1/2 inch thick of solid rubber with all these screws screwed into it and being glued on to make sure that this outsole stays on at all costs. And with all those layers, it took 331 pounds to puncture through to the inside of the boot. And that's not even including that super thick leather shank that adds an extra 1/4 inch of leather throughout like half of the boot. And we've cut plenty of these boots in half, so we know exactly how they're built and what's on the inside. And one of the craziest things is you would assume this is probably just glued together with some of the sewing and a couple of screws in the bottom, but these have anywhere from 60 to 80 nails in each individual boot that are hammered into these layers that aren't just nails, they're little clinch nails. As it hits that last, they clinch over, hooking all those layers together along with the glue. So that's how you end up with a 3-pound boot that's nearly indestructible. It also has a stitch down the toe. The upper flares out and is stitched down through the midsole layers, which helps keep dirt out, keeps water out. So then why do these boots historically use such narrow lasts on all their other boots? Well, let's cut these in half and I'll show you why and how, some of the pros and cons and the differences from this Thurman Munson inspired last compared to their more narrow almond lasts. All right, we got them cut in half, and I cut right through one of those clinch nails that hits the bottom of the last, and so it's gonna be a perfect example. So let's see what's inside. Now we have this cut in half, and you can see that little clinch nail and how it hooks all those layers together, and there's like 60 of those in each one of these boots. And you can see how much leather is in here and how over time that conforms the shape of your foot, and why so many people like these boots for work. And like I mentioned, these boots are made for some of the most intense and toughest jobs in the world, like firefighting, construction, logging, and you're in these boots for hours and hours a day, for miles on end, for weeks on end. But aesthetically, it might not be everyone's top choice because it is wider, it has the more anatomical shape, has a little bit of a bulbous toe, so So that's something to consider as well. So why didn't any of these Pacific Northwest brands use the Munson last until Nix did this year? Well, because most of these boots historically were made for firefighters and loggers that needed their feet to be fully locked in. But now that these boots have become adopted by other workers of every kind and casual wears, a more anatomical last was needed. So I just love the fact that these boots that have been made in the same style for over 100 years takes a last made from over 100 years to make some of the most toughest durable boots today that basically have remained unchanged for over 100 years. And I just love that stuff. And speaking of time-honored traditions and brands, it's Nix 60th anniversary this year. They're doing $60 off until the end of the month to celebrate. And they're doing some giveaways, so check that out below. And if you don't want to miss out on our ND4 that's going to be built on this last based off of another historical boot, be sure to sign up for the limited edition email list below. So thanks for watching this video and for all your support that allows us to tell these really cool, almost nearly lost stories to history and time. But because of your support, it allows us to tell these stories through the lens of these boots and shoes and these lasts that you really would never be able to find anywhere else. And I love doing it. So thank you guys. See ya.